This video is explaining the additions to the code that enable some graphics to appear on our little website. So when we looked at this one, what we actually have now is our guessing game, that when we enter in a different guess, the slider automatically moves along to the correct point. Obviously for this one we needed to download the actual background and the graphic on top. We've had to actually work those out. What's important to note is that from the edge to 0 is 25 pixels, and there's 50 pixels along each of the gaps. So there's a little bit of maths later on, and this arrow is also 25 pixels by 25. So in order to get the arrow pointing at the bottom, in the middle, we've basically got to go 25 pixels along, and then move it back into the center, which is basically back another sort of 12.5 pixels, so it lines up perfectly. Not the nicest way of doing it, but it gets the job done. Now, what we have is 3 sections. We've got a style, text or CSS, starting, and then finishing on line 33, so it goes from line 6 to 33, and there are 3 different styles. What we have is the graphic box, so that's the area where everything is going to be placed inside, so it's like a container. We've got the slider, which is the background, and the arrow. The arrow has the most details, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the graphics box, we want it to be, our graphics is 300 pixels wide, 50 high, and it's going to be relative to everything else that it is contained inside. We've got the slider, which is the graphic. This position is going to be absolute because we want it to start exactly where it's positioned in the code later. Its width has been set to 300 pixels and 50. It's got a top and left of 0 pixels, so it starts in the top left corner, and it's got a background image which is set to my background file. Obviously if your file is called something different, you need to make sure it's exactly the same. This example assumes it's in the same folder. If it was in an images folder, we'd add a bit of code in just to get it to point to the correct folder. The arrow, once again I've got its height and width of 25 pixels, its absolute position, its top position, and its left position where I want it to start. So the idea with that being is I want to move it in sort of 15 pixels on the left hand side, so it's pretty much in position. It should technically be like 12.5, but we'll just leave it at 15 for this example. And the URL is the arrow.png. Would have made it easier if I made the picture actually just 20 by 20. Now, these WebKits, you can Google up on these, have a look at a lot of the details that are in W3 Schools and other places. So WebKits is ways of basically displaying information on the screen. The transition is the default property of what it wants to do. So left, we want it to move 0.5 seconds, and we're going to ease it out. So it's basically how it's going to move. The WebKit is, default what's used by sort of Safari and other browsers such as things that are on the iPod and iPhone. I think it's also partly used in some form by Chrome. I'm not sure about Internet Explorer. The Mozilla, basically used by Firefox. So they just have, it's basically just telling us how to display the information on the page. Generally, the transition, once everything fully supports HTML5, transition will become the default. And once again, these are all IDs, so they've got little hashes in front of them. And the difference between classes is the classes have the dots. So, we now move on to lines 35 to 38. So lines 35 and 38 are the start of the graphic box, and also the closing of the graphic box. So that's our container, and all the graphics get placed inside them. Then, underneath that, we put in the slider layer, which is the background graphic, and then the next one is the arrow. Important to note that as you add things down, it's like sheets of paper. The one at the bottom actually ends up sort of being displayed like the first and the top level on the screen, because it processes when displaying the pages from top to bottom. So it gets this, displays that on the screen, then it realizes it needs to do this and puts that over top. There are ways to manually alter the layers by setting like Z indexes but you can look up those later. Okay, don't need to change any of the output sections, that all stays the same. Same with all the variables, no changes at all there. We need to add a new variable for the arrow, for handling that. And let's go about arrow, document query selector, hashtag arrow. So basically when we get the arrow, this is what we want to do with it. Same as what we did with the input and output. Basically just gets that arrow object. So in this case, it's going to be actually a div tag. Very useful because we can this document.query selector because we can grab any element of the web page at all. Now we scroll down, no changes at all here, and we pretty much end up going all the way down to the bottom. First thing I'm going to do is add in a function render. These lines won't actually let it add up because there's a little one extra line of code we've got to add in a bit earlier. Function render, so this is going to update the arrow on the screen. So get the arrow, get its style, move it left, so it's left alignment position. Start with our index of 15 where it's positioned at the start. Add on the guess, so whatever the guess has been typed in, so let's say 10 times by 5, so 10 times 5 is 50. Add that on 65 and put px on the end, px meaning pixels. It's important to note that JavaScript follows BIDMAS or BODMAS rules, brackets, exponents, operators, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. Really important to remember those when you're trying to work out where things are actually going to go. You can always, just put the brackets around things just to make it a bit clearer, but it's not needed. Okay, so we've now gone and worked out how to move the arrow. We haven't actually told the game to actually do it. So we're going to go back into the play game function, and we're just going to chuck in right at the end of the code the render command, and that will tell the computer to go and move the arrow. Now, a lot of things in there. What generally can go wrong is if you type in the graphics incorrectly or can't find the graphics, you're just not going to get anything showing up. If you type in the dimensions incorrectly, or if you've used different sized pictures, you're going to need to recalculate your guess and positioning. Obviously, get this one sort of working, and then actually try and customize it. Put in your own graphics. You can actually have, like a little character that moves along. You even put animated GIFs in there. And so this is basically moving us towards getting some sort of simple games that are going to be coming along.